Hi everyone, I'm back with another video on Vaush as promised, and in case if you didn't watch my first one, it's right here. But I do have some news concerning my channel that I have to share with you before we get into it. First, I likely will not return to Discord after constant targeted bans of my account and my community coming from people who like to abuse children and dress up like this. Sorry, it was a nice place, but if you wish to get in touch with me, you won't be able to do that on Discord as my account has been disabled after being active on it for about 30 hours. Instead, you can either write to me directly at my email, or what I would prefer you to do is to join my Telegram channel that I'm turning into a newsroom, an opinion letter, and a community area reserved for people who clearly know how to behave. At least they respect freedom of speech there and don't have any shady stories floating around them unlike Discord. And generally, I want it to be a high quality area, and if you want to help me to co-run it, please message me on Telegram because I want this place to grow. The second part I'll mention right at the end, and it's concerning Adam something, but for now let's get into the meat of today's video, which if you have seen the title of this video, it will be about IQ, race and Vaush. Now, the video I'm responding to is titled "Race does not equal IQ" and has about the same amount of views as my most popular video, and if you look at the comment section, his audience does not seem to disagree with the argumentation that he puts forward there, and looking at the ratio of likes to dislikes, one would assume that this was generally a good informative video, maybe one or two minor mistakes, perhaps a few misinterpretations, but generally he was on point. Well, if you truly think this way after you watch this video, and perhaps you're even a fan of Vaush, this is what one may refer to as an echo chamber effect, where one does not realize the inherent problems with Vaush's logic because nobody from his community seems to find any problems with it either. Frankly, in my video titled "Ranking the Worst Bread Tubers", I have suggested that Vaush is highly intelligent, and watching this video as well as Doomer Politics video, or as he is better now known as Doomer Media, by the way you should check out my interview with him and a couple of others, as well as me rewatching Vaush after half a year of not watching him, had led me to reevaluate his intellect. Now, I'm still in the opinion that he is not an idiot and is definitely more rhetorically skilled than yours truly, and certainly more than a half of political YouTubers online when it comes to his knowledge on a certain topic that he barely knows about, such as race. He experiences what is properly referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect, while the audience gets an impression that he's an expert on it because he is rhetorically skilled, yet terribly misunderstanding it and constantly spreading disinformation that other people will repeat after him because he sounded confident.
Here's the quick argument against hereditarianism. Now, first of all, I should say there is absolutely no 100% evidence in either direction, because controlling for environmental factors to a total extent is virtually impossible. And it's so virtually impossible, it might never actually be capable of being done.
Starts off dismissingly talking about the giant research done on intelligence in different populations. Well, Vaush, there is such a thing that is called genomic wide association studies, where you don't even need to control for anything, but to go with that logic, it can simply be applied to any trait being measured, not just intelligence, and with that logic we would then be justified in rejecting the science behind everything we have measured. Examples such as human sexuality, certain diseases, personality traits, predispositions towards certain behaviors, criminality, and etc. are all measured similarly to race and IQ. However, they are not as controlled for with regression analysis unlike race and IQ because it's not considered to be controversial. Thankfully, we're not banning research on schizophrenia, nor will you ever see serious academics calling for the censorship on the genetic correlates of non-heterosexuality or ADHD, and honestly I'm glad they are not the enemies of a free society. Unfortunately, we barely allow any research on criminality, which should be explored more, but I digress. This argument actually was his most significant one, because whatever comes right after it is pure Dunning-Kruger effect, and let me play you the whole thing.
Very often, the opening line for these race and IQ types will be, "Why don't you believe in evolution?" What they'll essentially suggest is, hey, human populations were split up into different continents for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years. Why does it surprise you that we would evolve differently? Well, here's the problem. The features that did evolve between humans very visibly, such as hair texture, skin color, iris color, nose shape, and a few other things are usually single genetic traits, or like 2 or 3 gene traits that are very easily affected by external stimuli. Your skin, your nose, your hair, this is all exposed to the elements. Your brain and your intelligence is incredibly polygenetic. It is vastly more complicated, which means far more genes would need to be influenced to affect the eventual outcome, to change your intelligence, your IQ. And B, your brain's in your skull, man. It's not being affected by the sun or the wind or the rain. It's not being affected by the difference in climate between the equatorial belt in Africa and like the cold fjords of Finland. Your brain's up here in your skull. It is insulated from the main environmental factors that would cause a genetic change to begin with.
Well, there were a couple of claims made, which I will go through one by one. First is that primary evolutionary differences are cosmetic. This is essentially your average race is just a skin color. Well, if that was the case, then we would find most of the genes that differ between races expressed in the skin color, bone structure, muscle tissue, skull size. Oh wait, races can't differ by brain size. In reality, this is not what we see. Cosmetic racial differences are very insignificant compared to racial differences that amount to different behavior and lifestyle choices. Moreover, as Vaush had pointed out, that brain genes are incredibly polygenetic, which he thinks supports his case for whatever reason, but again, Dunning-Kruger effect. In reality, almost all genes, or 84% of them, express in the brain in one way or another, and this is just mainstream science. In other words, not only that 84% of all genes influence the brain, but the genes that influence intelligence as any other trait are properly identified, and you can actually send your DNA to test for intelligence or any other trait or predispositions, as I already did with mine, finding many predictive correlates towards certain behaviors and lifestyles. Because Vaush has taken sociology, he might have not known the fact that there are literal genomic-wide association studies that are being conducted on different racial groups, always finding the same results. Not only that, but unlike, for example, Parkinson's disease that, for example, I'm predisposed to more so than the 98% of the population, Parkinson's disease is not as heritable as intelligence. It's more environmental, and perhaps I might have a chance of not acquiring it in my lifetime.
And your intelligence is incredibly polygenetic.
The mechanisms of those genomic-wide association studies work totally on polygenetic scoring, just as there are polygenetic scores for intelligence, as Vaush gladly informed us, but forgot to tell you that they differ by race. Finally, there is this.
Your brain's up here in your skull. It is insulated from the main environmental factors that would cause a genetic change to begin with.
Which just shows that he perhaps did not even take a biology course in high school, which is remarkable for our time and age that sociology graduates are not familiar with the basic reality of things, especially those who are in the justice system, gender studies, queer studies, and sociology major. Apparently, the logic goes something like this. As all races, for some reason, have evolved due to a different sun exposure or something, because that's the dominant message in our culture, can deny it, consequently, the brain was protected by the skull, and so the sun didn't get through it and didn't have any meaningful impact. And that's certainly true, the sun didn't at all influence the brain. However, the rest is absolutely bonkers. As we have already established, 84% of all genes are expressed in the brain. People constantly identify genetic contributions for intelligence, usually in the form of GWAS, and these differ by races, as well as the heritability of intelligence between races is about the same. An argument like this is clearly ridiculous. If that was the case, we would also not see any differences in dog breeds or any other animal animals because the sun treated them the same. And guess what? Their brain is under their skull, so they can't differ in intelligence either, it seems. If that was the logic, then we would also not see eugenics working in practice, and we would also not see different brain sizes correlate with intelligence according to this meta-analysis, or even the brain structure itself, which again differs racially. Finally, we would not expect to find specific genes associated with intelligence, and we all do. In reality, races evolve to different selective pressures. For example, as it is argued in the book The 10,000 Years Explosion, Ashkenazi Jews, due to their selective pressures of anti-Semitism, specific job allocations associated with intelligence, and being constantly exposed to literacy, were selected for very high verbal intelligence. Under similar conditions, the Brahmins of India were selected. Moreover, animals are constantly being selected for different traits, and they don't have to wait like 1500 years as in the case of Ashkenazi Jews to become what they are today. In other words, the differences between races are due to their different evolutionary life history and selective pressures. Not understanding that is not understanding how the process of evolution and natural selection works. It is for those kind of people academic texts such as this one exist, and if you have any objections to me, you should definitely read it. He essentially has the same understanding of evolution as Jared Diamond, who in his book Guns, Germs and Steel has concluded that in fact it is blacks who are in fact more superior to whites in intelligence because for some reason they live in the woods. And honestly, this is not his fault per se. He is just a dumb midwit repeating what he hears from people who are higher than him hierarchically. This is a problem of our current ruling class and the system created by them that needs to be addressed. If this is not addressed, inequalities between races and other groups are blamed for racism and not the inherent genetic handouts that different people are born with. I may understand some people having problems with what I say, but what will bring more conflict? Blaming whites for differences in outcome between races, which is driving the BLM, crime and critical race theory at the moment, or looking into what makes those differences in outcome in the first place, which by the way is not fully genetic and there are environmental contributions, and it would be silly to deny that this is the case. We already did that with mental illnesses and sexuality and different traits. Both, by the way, are less genetic than intelligence and there are barely any problems with it. So why not apply the same logic to, for example, intelligence, crime and other traits? Anyways, he then makes a series of attacks on the IQ itself, which as we find out is not a big deal apparently.
Over the past 100 years, the average IQ of an American has risen sharply, like really far. I think it's like 30 or 40, well, maybe not 30 or 40, hold on. Now, keep in mind, that means that when people talk about the inherent genetic inferiority of black people for their lower IQ, what they're saying is today the average black person is about as intelligent and has about as high of an IQ as the average white person did in the 1940s, you know? But even if it was a fact of the matter, that some portion of the difference between black and white people and their IQ was genetic, what the fuck would that change? Like what? So maybe black people have on average a 5 lower IQ. I don't believe this is the case, by the way, but if black people had on average like 5 lower IQ, that would mean they're about as smart as like the average white person in 1982. Like, that's your dad. That's younger than my dad. Like, what fucking difference does that make? Like, that's nothing. That's absolutely nothing. It's meaningless, you know?
Essentially made two big claims. He's certainly right to say that the IQ of Americans had risen until the mid-2000s or late 1990s to people's phenotypic maximum. Of course, he didn't mention the last part and probably thinks that IQ is still rising and probably doesn't know the difference between phenotypic IQ and genotypic IQ. Reduced exposure to harmful chemicals, no malnourishment, and overall literacy has contributed to it, and consequently genotypic IQ has stopped growing at that period as factors that didn't allow it to grow were gotten rid of, and same thing throughout the West. The Flynn effect has stopped and has been reversed, being referred to as the negative Flynn effect, and I will get into the reasons why it was the case. However, there is evidence that the Flynn effect is still alive and well in countries of sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and perhaps even Russia, or it has stopped there a couple of years ago. We don't know, but we will definitely know in 10 years. But in any event, the Flynn effect will stop there too, as these countries would get rid of malnourishment, alcoholism, and other factors that I have mentioned. There is actually a great chapter on this topic in the book In the Know 35 Myths About Intelligence by Russell Warren. However, this is not even the point. One has to understand that when it comes to IQ, there are two components to it, the genotypic component and the phenotypic component. The genotypic component is the G-loaded one, and the phenotypic component is a combination of the genotypic component with the environment. But I'd like to focus your attention on the G-loaded or the genotypic component of IQ, that by the way has a negative relationship with the culturally loaded phenotypic component, as you would expect them to have given they are different, and what's more interesting is that our genetic intelligence is declining after being pushed to our phenotypic maximums. This component has been on the decrease since the late 19th century, in some places but in others in the mid-20th century, and there are many books and studies documenting that with no opposing evidence. The consistent findings throughout all studies is that genotypic intelligence drops by about 1 IQ point per generation. We are essentially selecting bad traits as our selective pressures have been dropped to the worse, and intelligent people have less children than non-intelligent people. Moreover, James Flynn admits himself that the Flynn effect has been environmentally driven, however also thinks that its decline has also been environmental for some reason, which it is definitely not, given the evidence for the genotypic decline of it and the negative relationship between the G-loadedness and the Flynn effect. Ironically enough, he admits that the Flynn effect is a national phenomenon and has no bearing on racial differences, and why would it, given that heritability for intelligence among different races is virtually the same, and the black to white IQ gap is virtually the same since the time it was first measured. There is no progress. The only thing we will likely see is an increase in the racial gap, because blacks behave even more dysgenically than whites, as high IQ blacks barely have any children, which further contributes to continuous growth of inequality between whites and blacks. In other words, in around 100 years from now, we would expect a 20 IQ gap instead of a 15 IQ gap, something that W.E.B. Du Bois would clearly have been staunchly against, as he had similar views on this topic as I do, but unfortunately the black community and the general public at large will not be aware of this unfortunate development, at least anytime soon, and unfortunately we will be awakened to it when it will be too late. So to claim that an average black person now has the same IQ as a white person in the 1940s or the 1980s for that matter is obviously incorrect, because according with that logic, a white person from the 18th century would have an IQ of equivalent to about 60, which I mean is severe intellectual disability. Another claim is that IQ does not matter, bro. Well, if that was the case, then it would not have such strong correlations with life outcomes, right? For example, the relationship between IQ and crime is this. Now, the relationship between intelligence and income is just 0.3. Yet, despite that, those who have an IQ of 80 will on average earn about $20,000 per year, while those with an IQ of 125 and above will earn almost 10 times as much. Similarly, this relationship is the same when it comes to an occupation. Some professions are more G-loaded than others. This is why unfortunately you don't see many Black Thomas Sowells or businessmen in the Fortune 500. Yet there are many Jewish names present in these lists, which some who are not racial realists will use as evidence of some sort of a conspiracy. Finally, there are tons of correlates of IQ and life outcomes such as violence, academic performance, job performance, and etc. For more on that, you can familiarize yourself with Charles Murray's work or increasingly a large number of academics. And those relationships still remain even if you control for everything that can be possibly controlled for, similarly as genetics or family ancestry, as it was replaced with, were far greater of a predictive factor than school even in the 1960s in terms of academic achievement in one of the largest ever studies done on the US soil headed quoted by James Coleman, which still hasn't been contradicted by a single study, yet our ruling class still pushes for obviously failed policies such as No Child Left Behind, and sociologists still cry about poor schooling and racism. The final claim that he brings up in this conversation is that black people are conditioned to have lower IQ, and for that matter, because I want to spread some good ideas instead of just getting credit for it myself, I actually want you to read a book by Russell Warren debunking 34 more ridiculous assertions such as this one that you can either buy or find in certain places. Well, as we are approaching near the end, I want to say this. Dear leftists, this is your spokesman on race. This is the person that will tell you that all or most differences between the races are due to racism, while obviously being absolutely not familiar with the actual science at hand. As Russell Warren pointed out in his book, the general public is about 50 years behind the experts. On one hand, you've got intelligence experts on IQ who think that 84% of racial differences are at least in part due to genetics. On the other, you've got the general public, sociologists, historians, anthropologists, and many others who think that either race doesn't even exist or that there are no racial differences in intelligence because, as Vaush gladly puts it best,
your brain's up here in your skull. It is insulated from the main environmental factors that would cause a genetic change to begin with.
Anyways, as I've promised you, there will be another message to my audience, and it's about Adam something again. Apparently, my videos had wounded him so deeply that he made another post coping and naming all the reasons on why he should not engage with me, basically in order to justify his own ignorance and refusal to debate. And to my surprise, some sections of his own audience had seen through his crap and called him out, which I really appreciate. But here are his reasons. First is that I'm apparently an early 2016 Sargon. Well, to paraphrase one of my subscribers, it is likely due to a reason that this is the only right-winger he knows about and uses as a reference point. Frankly, I have never been accused of behaving like Sargon of Akkad, and I don't know if I truly give you Sargon of Akkad impressions, but if I do, please feel free to comment below. But as far as I know, we are not similar, though I still respect him, yet wish for him to get beyond being constantly outraged by the left and focus on positive right-wing development. But anyways, he then says that I have nothing to offer really, which his own viewers disagree with, and if you watch these two videos in particular, you would know that I did hint to an alternative. In addition, as I gain more subscribers, I will produce way more original videos than I do now, and to add more, I have about 5 rough drafts waiting for a perfect moment, and honestly I can't wait to publish them. The other reason is responsible platforming, which is a standard NPC talking point I hear often on the left. It essentially means you don't want to give any attention to right-wingers because the gullible masses may be tricked by them, just as I suppose many Eastern Europeans were tricked by the misinformation and CIA propaganda campaigns coming from the West, which resulted in the collapse of socialism in Eastern Europe. Similar logic is also used by religious fundamentalists when it comes to protecting their own beliefs against heresy and blasphemy in the form of Sam Harris's lectures, or women's rights campaigns in countries that happen to be US allies. This is nothing new really, and only should tell you more about the person who is calling for this type of decentralized censorship and silencing than the person who is being silenced. And I get this logic, but it does say a lot about the quality of the beliefs of someone who behaves this way. The final statement is that he tried to reach out to me, which was basically him saying in the chat, "Oh, I don't mind talking with Ubersoy, but Ubersoy will probably never do it because he's a coward, but when I did it, apparently I got banned by the bot and not by Adam or his mods, which is not what his own audience even buys." Well, if that was truly the case and you didn't lie, Adam, and I know you're watching this, you would probably not block me and deny my friend request, right? Oh well, we both know what happened happened. There's no reason to lie now, and I very much enjoy how you had to write this little blog post. My words are really a heavy weight on your chest that you deeply had to take off, and you kept thinking about it and started doubting your own ideology, so you had to comfort yourself with this blog post. I get that, but in your post there was a comment about how it was existing as a form of dirt under your nails, and I honestly thought more about it, and that person is not entirely wrong. Though a better name for me would be a gadfly that can bite and drink blood. I'm grabbing your audience away, although not to the rate that I want, and the algorithms certainly don't help me, yet for now I am dependent on doing responses to you, Vaush, others, but eventually this will change and we both know that. But going back to your second reason, which is that I'm low in dominance hierarchy to deserve a response, well, does it really mean that if I'll be higher in the dominance hierarchy, you will then give my ideas credit and talk with me? I feel like this goes against your values, and perhaps, as I have alluded before, you're not truly a left-winger, you're just a village idiot. Perhaps I'm even better at being a left-winger than you, as at least I'm genetically predisposed to being a leftist. Plus, I'm not sure if I want to be as famous as you, as it will mean I will have to compromise on my intellectual quality, but I'm still growing, though I very much doubt I'll ever reach the numbers that you have, and frankly, God forbid, I wouldn't want to appeal to the lowest common denominator.